Welcome to The Print. We are here to talk about whether the government will be able to meet its disinvestment targets for the year 2019-20. On yesterday in a late night cabinet meeting, the government announced the strategic sale of 5 public sector enterprises. These include the oil marketing company BPCL, Shipping Corporation of India, Container Corporation of India, NEEPCO and THDC Limited. So of the first 3 I mentioned are listed companies, and the other 2, the NEEPCO and THDC, are unlisted companies and will be taken over by NTPC. So the government proposes to reduce its stake below 51% in other central public sector enterprises also. So in the first 5 that I said, in BPCL, in Shipping Corporation of India, and in Container Corporation of India, the government will find a strategic buyer and relinquish management control to the private company. So the government's full year disinvestment target is around 1.05 lakh crore. Of that, it has at present garnered around rupees 17,000 crores only, say in the 8 months of this fiscal. So in the last 4 months, the government has to now garner nearly more than 85,000 crores to meet its disinvestment targets. It seems like an uphill task, but if one looks, if the government is able to push through at least the 3 major ones this fiscal, the Shipping Corporation of India, Container Corporation of India, and BPCL, it is going to get much more than 80,000 crores. So the current value of the government's holding, because these are listed companies, so it's easy to calculate what are the value of the government's holdings in these 3 companies. That would be around 80,000 crores as per current market prices. But the government expects to garner much more than this 80,000 crores, because it's also going to relinquish management control in these enterprises. So it is likely that the valuations that the government will arrive at will be much higher than this amount. But it's a long, painstaking process, because the government will have to now appoint investment bankers, valuers, lawyers to enable this share sale. So please do send us your questions, and we will try to answer them. The government's disinvestment revenue, the government's disinvestment revenue has become really crucial for this government. That is because tax revenues have been falling, and the government is struggling to meet its fiscal deficit target of 3.3% of gross domestic product. So the government, the tax revenues as of September 2019 were only around 37% of the full year budgeted target. So ideally by September, you typically, if the government has to achieve the full year targets, the tax revenue collections should have been at least around 50% of the budgeted targets, but they were only at 37%. So that shows that there's been a massive shortfall. Data that has come in after that also doesn't seem very encouraging, because there is a slowdown in the economy, and if there is a slowdown in the economy, it is bound to show up in direct tax and indirect tax collections. So direct tax collections in the form of a fall in corporate tax, that is paid by companies, because they're not earning profits as their volumes are shrinking. Also, the indirect tax sales through GST, because consumer demand has fallen. Because of that, sales of consumer durable goods, sales of automobiles, they're all falling. This is obviously being reflected in the collections of GST revenues also. So the government is really constrained on the taxes side, and it has pinned all hopes on its disinvestment pipeline that has, besides these companies that I mentioned, the government also plans to sell off its stake in Air India. So earlier, the government had not planned to completely exit Air India, but given the lukewarm response the first time around from investors, the government has agreed to completely exit Air India. So, that is another big disinvestment that's in the pipeline. The government is hoping that it can push through these big ticket sales before March, but then it's a race against time, because, hardly 4.5 months left. So please do send us your questions, and we'll be happy to answer them. The government will sell around 53% in BPCL and relinquish management control. In Shipping Corporation of India, it will sell its entire stake of around 63.75%. In Container Corporation of India, interestingly, the government plans to retain some stake. So it's going to sell off 30.8% of its 54.8% stake. So it will be left with 24.8% stake. The government's contention is that Container Corporation of India and provides synergies with the railways and is an integral part of the system, and because of that they have decided to hold on to the stake for now. If you will look at the previous disinvestments that we saw during the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government, so the government had chosen in some cases to completely exit, even as they handed over the stake in the company as well as management control to the private buyer. But in some cases, it still continues to hold a stake. For instance, it's this disinvestment of Hindustan Zinc, when it sold the company to Vedanta, as well as handed over management control. Similar the case, but decided to retain a small stake in the company. Similarly is the case with Balco. Balco is not a listed company, but still the government has not exited the company. So one question we're getting is, can it be done in 4 months? What is the process now? So now that the government has got the formal cabinet approval, the backend, a lot of the backend work has been done, but the government has to formally initiate valuations of the company. It has to appoint investment bankers, it has to appoint lawyers, and then it has to, prepare bid documents and invite companies to bid for these companies. So it may take time, but for say like a company like BPCL, many foreign investors, many foreign companies have evinced interest. BPCL is among the profitable oil marketing companies that India has, and it's a well-run company is what analysts say, and they expect a lot of interest from many foreign companies. These include the companies like Rosneft, like Saudi Aramco. So there's a lot of interest in BPCL. So because of that, probably the government will not face the same problem that it faced, in case of an Air India, where it didn't get even one bid during its initial sale process that it had initiated. So Ashutosh Mishra is asking me that what is the status of Air India disinvestment. So again, that's also in the works. The government is again renegotiating the bid document, redrafting the bid document to make it more attractive. Air India comes with its own set of problems. It has a huge debt on its balance sheet. There's also a problem of its employees, what happens to the employees' fates. There's this whole question of, what will be done with the employees? Will they be asked to leave? Will they be given an VRS? But major issue seems to be, as of now, the debt and the employee. So the entity has to be made attractive enough for a buyer this time around. Last time, because the government had decided to retain some stake in the airline, investors were not interested because they feared government interference. But because this time it's going to be an outright sale, the government is hoping that they will find more buyers for Air India. Also, this whole proposal of hiving off some of the debt into a special purpose vehicle to again make the company relatively with less debt exposure is in the works. So the government has expressed hope that it should be able to complete the disinvestment of Air India by the end of this fiscal year, that is by March 31st, 2020. Shivanand Kokate is asking, is any specific information how they will spend this money, or they just add this in revenue? So it goes into the consolidated funds of the government of India, and it's up to the government on how it spends this money. Given the fact that there's going to be a huge shortfall in tax collections, some tax analysts are pegging that number at nearly 1.5 to 2 trillion, the shortfall in both direct tax and indirect tax collections for 2019-20. Most likely these disinvestment receipts will just go in helping the government balance its books and achieve its fiscal deficit target of 3.3%. At a time when growth is expected to slow down to 5% for the full year, it may not be an easy number to achieve, because direct tax collections do get adversely impacted because of a slowdown in growth numbers. how far can Arvind S is asking on how far can privatization solve India's economic crisis in the short and medium term? So there are two arguments and logics to for and against privatization. Some say it's a short-term solution. You're selling governments, you're selling these assets just to tide over a short-term, fiscal deficit problem. But once you sell these assets, they remain sold. So once you're selling your family jewels, you will not get them back. So that's one argument that comes in. Another argument that comes in is that if the government doesn't proceed with disinvestment, these companies may become uncompetitive, similar to what we are seeing in BSNL and MTNL's case. These companies may head towards bankruptcy, not be able to compete in this with the private sector, and eventually, their value could just erode. So that's one logic where, so obviously, if you look at the privatization drive during the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government between 1998 and 2004, you will see that most of the privatizations at that point of time actually added wealth to the enterprise. So the entities, the non-strategic entities in the non-strategic sector where the government exited, they have all relatively done well when they have completely moved to the private sector. So, in a conversation with ThePrint, the Maruti Suzuki chairman R.C. Bhargav had actually mentioned on how a government company faces many more legal and audit restrictions compared to what say a private company will face, because the government company is open to a writ filing or a writ petition by people. It is also subject to CAG audits. It has a lot more, it cannot, its appetite to take risks is much lesser when compared to a private entity. All these factors ensure that probably a government companies cannot compete with the private sector as India is opening up in many of its sectors to foreign investment. So, there are arguments for on both sides of this. The next question we have, Tarush Kakar is asking that can international firms buy the PSUs? So in case of BPCL, a lot of foreign companies have evinced interest and may be able to acquire the government's 53.5% stake in the company. Amit Patel is asking, will disinvestment boost the confidence of the consumer? Eventually disinvestment at this point of time is also about making these firms more competitive and helping them survive in the highly competitive market, and also at the same time helping government achieve revenues. In the short term, I'm not sure if there will be a direct impact on consumer confidence because of disinvestment. Devdup Sur is asking if is there any more hurdles left before the government, before it can sell its stake in BPCL? If you mean legislative hurdles, no. The cabinet approval has come in. That doesn't need the government doesn't need to bring in any more amendments to any laws to facilitate BPCL's stake sale. So at this moment, everything that remains is procedural in terms of finalizing the investment bankers, the lawyers, the valuers for the company. Also, making the valuations attractive enough for an investor to come and opt to purchase the government stake in BPCL. And since it's an outright sale, the government is completely exiting. One worry that the investors have of the government probably interfering gets removed, because when the government is completely exiting as well as handing over management control, the private buyer will have complete say over the operations of the company. The next question we have. Debusur is again asking that isn't this a one-time money-making policy? How do they expect this to stabilize its coffers? Wouldn't it be better if these companies were made to perform better and grow organically? As I mentioned earlier, there are two sets of arguments on this. So one, there has been this set of argument that the government should not be present in non-strategic sectors and should completely exit and performance role as performance governance role, rather than having stakes in companies where which don't operate in per se strategic sectors. So that has been one logic that has been followed by the NDA governments over the years, beginning with the Vajpayee government in between 1999 and 2004. The other argument, as you rightly said, is okay, if you sell these enterprises now, it will help the government get some revenues this year. Then, but what happens next year? But again, once the argument again goes that privatization does help in creating wealth, and these enterprises may not have any value if the government continues to hold a stake in these enterprises, and probably make them uncompetitive and over the years. So Tarush Kakkar is asking that why are they not selling BSNL, MTNL and public sector banks? The government has said how BSNL and MTNL are important entities when it comes to the government ensuring telecom connectivity across centers, many remote centers in the country. So they have expressed their intent. But another thing is that the financial position of both BSNL and MTNL is really bad, and the government will hardly get any funds if it does decide to divest its stake in these two enterprises at the moment. The kind of financial crunch that they are facing has even ensured that the salaries of some of the employees, I think for the month of October, have not been paid. So, it's okay if the government wants to sell BSNL and MTNL, but you also need buyers, right? So when a firm is in the, and given the competition that the telecom sector is currently seeing, it will be difficult to find buyers for companies like BSNL and MTNL. So that's probably one of the reasons. Public sector banks, again, is a very touchy issue. They are, for disinvestment in public sector banks, the government will have to amend the Bank Nationalization Act. So for that, it needs to go back to the legislature. So what they have instead done is they've opted for a bank mergers among the public sector banks so that they can create some strong entities. The only bank where they could have diluted their stake, basically privatized, was IDBI Bank without having to go to the parliament for legislative approval, because IDBI Bank is regulated by a separate act. The government did try to sell IDBI to private companies, but eventually, given the lack of interest, given the high level of bad debts in IDBI Bank, the government had to opt had to settle for selling the IDBI Bank stake to Life Insurance Corporation of India, which is again another state-run enterprise. So at this moment, given the fact that the banks are struggling to with their bad debts and their profitability, they may not really find buyers at this time, and probably at this moment the government is unlikely to go down that route, because banks somehow is much more politically difficult to privatize banks than to probably privatize these PSUs. And probably the last question that we will take is from Sudhanshu Akarte. Is asking if disinvestment is in favor of the poor. So I don't really know what kind of an impact disinvestment will have on the poor, because there's no really any direct correlation when it comes to these kind of industries and their impact on the poor. So as it is, oil prices have already been deregulated. So, any increase in international oil prices does get passed down to everyone in the country. So per se, disinvestment of BPCL or privatization of BPCL should not have any direct impact on the poor. So thank you for watching us. This is Remya Nair, and please do subscribe to our YouTube channel.